So, Kent State. Now, the Kent State shootings. They were sparked a new round of college protests at Harvard, Berkeley, and then in other places. Kent State, probably the most famous. The ROTC building was firebombed at Kent State, and the National Guard was called out, and 200 protesters began to throw rocks at the troops. Please, if you are protesting, do not throw rocks at the men with guns. Shots might be fired, leaving 4 dead and 9 wounded. More than 1.5 million students went on strike over the country, closing several schools. Very similar to what we're seeing right now with the anti-Israel protests. 2 universities in California have canceled live commencement. They're just going to mail students their diplomas because of it. Nixon worked to undermine the protests as a siege mentality settled into the White House. And they ringed the White House with buses to protect it. And he refused to leave.
These bombs, blowing up the campuses. Listen, the lawyers that are on the college campuses today are the luckiest people in the world. Here they are, burning up the folks, storming around about this issue. You name it, get rid of the world, there'll be another.
This is footage of the riots in Kent State.
Further infuriated students already protesting over Cambodia. After 3 tense days of demonstrations at Kent State University in Ohio, nervous National Guardsmen opened fire. 4 students were killed. "My child was not a bomb," said the father of one dead girl. American campuses exploded. Hundreds of colleges and universities closed down. Governors in 16 states called out the police and National Guard. Nixon's supporters took to the streets as well. At New York City Hall, construction workers struggled to raise the flag which the mayor had lowered to honor the dead at Kent State. Nixon's move into Cambodia and his dividing of Americans into bums and heroes had set off a national firestorm. Angry protesters returned to Washington. As tensions rose, the Secret Service ringed the White House with a barricade of buses. It was like living in a bunker in the White House. You look out in the streets and see thousands of people protesting. You literally were afraid for your life. There were times when I can remember saying, I can't believe this is the United States of America, a free country. Here we are in the White House. The barricades up and buses around the White House and tear gas going off, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of protesters out in the streets, and troops sitting here. An embattled Nixon faced the press as anti-war demonstrators continued to flock to Washington.
They're trying to say that they want peace. They're trying to say that they want to stop the killing. They're trying to say that they want to end the draft. They're trying to say that we ought to get out of Vietnam. I agree with everything that they're trying to accomplish. I believe, however, that the decisions that I have made will serve that purpose.
That night, protesters circled the White House with chants and candles. Inside, a sleepless Nixon made more than 40 phone calls to friends and supporters around the country. Near dawn, he called for a car and asked to be driven to the Lincoln Memorial, where protesters had gathered. White House aide Eagle Krogh followed him.
It was, I guess it was almost a surreal atmosphere. It was almost like dreamlike. Is this really happening? Walking up the stairs of the Lincoln Memorial, and there was the president.
sort of standing in the middle of a group of young people who were wearing combat fatigues with peace symbols, bandanas, all of the clothing of the 60s and 70s, and trying very hard to communicate to.
I think I said, well, what are you going to do about the Kent State killings? What are you going to do about the war? He said, I'm really not here to talk about that right now. We're trying to handle things. So it was a one-way
This is the lady that
conversation.
is talking now, years
He
later.
was there trying to be very conversational and casual, and we were there outraged and angry and scared.
One student basically told him, he said, I hope that you realize that we are willing to die for what we believe in. And I think, as I recall, the president's response was, well, I understand that, but we're trying to build a world where people will not have to die for what they believe in.
When he appeared as the guest of honor at a Billy Graham crusade in Tennessee, Nixon had been in office 16 months. A majority of Americans still backed his Vietnam policy, but the furor over Cambodia had deepened the divisions Nixon had promised to mend. Even here, surrounded by thousands who supported him, the president could not escape the ceaseless storm of protest. Nixon continued to try to rally his supporters while denouncing his opponents, calling some among the protesters thugs and hoodlums, blaming his critics in Congress and the press for failing to support the war. All U.S. troops left Cambodia by the end of June, as Nixon had promised. He insisted that the military action which had caused such turmoil had eased the pressure on the troops in Vietnam. Withdrawals continued on schedule, but more American lives had been lost. There was no breakthrough in the peace talks. And in the White House, an increasingly frustrated and suspicious Nixon urged intensified surveillance of the anti-war movement. He grew distrustful even of his closest advisors, and installed hidden microphones in his own office, in part so that his aides could not later claim to have disagreed with his decisions. But the taping system would eventually trap the president himself.
Now, here is the Kent State issue. Now, after this, there begins a congressional revolt against the war. The court-martial of William Cawley, who was convicted of killing 22 civilians in Vietnam, In reality, he was involved with killing as many as 200 in a village suspected of supporting the enemy. He was convicted of killing 22, but he was really killed many more. Now, this happened a lot in the war. During World War II, you know, German prisoners are shot trying to escape when actually they were just murdered, or whatever the case may be. But there was a lot of this type of thing. And part of the problem was you get frustrated with the fact that you don't know who the enemy is. At least you could know who the enemy was. But when you're fighting in Vietnam, and to the Americans, everyone from Vietnam looks the same. You can't tell if they're from the north or the south, or if they're Cambodian or what. And half the people are friendly until they shoot you or blow themselves up and you with them. You become very jaded. Your goal is to live another day. Testimony of John Kerry before the Foreign Senate Relations Committee blasted the war as immoral and brought public opposition to 70% believing the military action was now a mistake. And this is John Kerry, who is now the climate czar for the current administration, former senator and presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. Congressional opposition to the war. The Senate voted to cut off funding for the campaign in Cambodia and not to support an invasion of Laos. Nixon accelerated troop withdrawals, leaving only 75,000 fighting troops in the country by the end of 1971. Now, Nixon also becomes the first president to visit Moscow and China. Nixon ended the draft in 1972, prior to the election, to try and get the youth vote to come to the Republican side. The peace deal seemed elusive, though, in 72. Then he had an opening with China, and at this time, the Chinese and the Russians had a split. So if you could exploit the differences between the Chinese and the Russians, that would be good. In February of 1972, while I was born, Nixon was in China. He met both Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai. Support for the administration of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations, replacing Taiwan. This put pressure on the USSR to lead an invasion in the extended invitation for Nixon to visit Moscow. And Moscow summit produced the first strategic arms limitation treaty, limited each side to 200 anti-ballistic missiles and a 5-year limitation on land-based submarine-launched missiles. Now we're moving into 1972. In 1972, Democrats were in trouble. Edward Kennedy was the presumed front-runner of the Democratic nomination until the Chappaquiddick incident, in which he ran off the road with his secretary in the car with him, who some believe was pregnant with his child. And he escaped the car and swam for help without notifying the police or anyone of the accident, and this lady drowned in the car. Later on, he would wear this neck brace in public in order to prove that he had been injured. But some believe that he left her for dead, and that she was alive long enough to be rescued if he hadn't been politically embarrassing. He had met on Chappaquiddick Island with a group of campaign workers with his brother's campaign in 1968, and may have had too much to drink and drove off the road and had his issues. The next person is this one here, Edwin Muskie, senator from Maine. He was a retread from 68. He opposed the war, supporter of the environmentalism, but a centrist on other social issues. His wife was criticized. And on a campaign appearance in New Hampshire, in the snow, he cried while talking about the attacks on his wife, and that made him look weak. So he lost. You don't want a president who will cry when his wife is called names in the press. He should have just got mad and punched the reporter in the face. Then he would have gotten votes. But you don't cry. At least not while it's snowing. George Wallace, who very well could have been the Democratic nominee in '72, but while campaigning in Laurel, Maryland, he was shot in the back by a man whose only goal was to become famous by shooting someone. He had tried to shoot President Nixon on more than one occasion and was in several different places where he could have shot Wallace before. And he shoots Wallace in the back. He doesn't kill him because he will continue in politics and runs for president again in a wheelchair in 1980 or 76. 76, I think it is. This is his wife jumping on top of him after the shooting to protect him in case they would go after him again till the ambulance arrived. So he's out. Then George McGovern was the nominee in '72. George McGovern was a liberal senator from South Dakota. Radically liberal. He wanted to legalize abortion, marijuana, distributive taxes, and major cuts in defense. Strongly anti-war. Rocked by the withdrawal of his vice presidential nominee, Thomas F. Eagleton, because it was discovered that he had seen a counselor. Can you imagine? Now everyone is in counseling, but back then, if you had seen a counselor or was to a psychiatrist, then you were crazy. Could not be trusted as a presidential candidate. He then offered the Democratic vice presidential nomination to just about anyone, and no one would take it. Eventually, Sargent Shriver, who is married to Maria Shriver, the sister to John Kennedy, the Kennedy's brother-in-law, he became the vice presidential nominee. Republicans, Richard Nixon was renominated with the support of the Committee to Re-elect the President, or by its acronym, CREEP. C-R-E-P, CREEP. The break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters at Watergate Complex was characterized as a third-rate burglary attempt and never impacted the campaign. The elimination of George Wallace as a third-party candidate was key to victory. Nixon won in a landslide, winning every state but one, Massachusetts.
Five men wearing white gloves and carrying cameras were caught early today in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington. They were caught by a night watchman and did not resist arrest when the police came. They apparently were unarmed, and nobody knows yet why they were there. Filming the camera hadn't even been exposed. In any case, they're being filmed.
On Sunday morning, June 18th, Richard Nixon later wrote, I left for Key Biscayne. When I got to my house, I could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen, and I went in to get a cup. There was a Miami Herald on the counter, and I glanced over the front page. The main headline was about the Vietnam withdrawals. There was a small story in the middle of the page on the left-hand side.
The Watergate Apartment Hotel office complex in Washington has a fortress-like appearance, but the burglars penetrated that security.
4 of the men arrested were Cuban nationals now living in Miami. And the fifth, James McCord, was a former FBI and CIA agent, recently employed as a security aide by the Republican National Committee and the Committee to re-elect the President.
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler today called the incident a third-rate burglary and nothing the president would be concerned with.
The president was concerned. On June 23rd, he met with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. To thwart the FBI investigation, Haldeman suggested that the break-in could be made to look like a CIA operation.
And it's very well because the FBI who are working engaged at this point feel that's what it is. It's CIA.
There is no evidence that Nixon had ordered the break-in, but his aides had. The president approved the plan to divert the FBI. I saw Watergate as politics pure and simple, Nixon wrote in his memoirs. We were going to play it tough. I never doubted that was exactly how the other side would have played it.
Richard Nixon pulled it into the White House. He couldn't leave it alone. And so within a week after the break-in, or maybe 2 weeks, he had personally involved himself in the intrigue of the whole thing. So Nixon sealed his fate 6 days after the break-in.
I'll stop it here, but Nixon sealed his fate in Watergate at that moment when he ordered the FBI to be diverted. Now, right after this, we have trying to get out of Vietnam, and get out of Vietnam in time to win the war. So, in Christmas, after the 72 election, before the inauguration, the second inauguration, he does something very cold, calculating, and extreme, even for Nixon. He bombed the North Vietnamese on Christmas. It was a cold, brutal campaign used to jumpstart peace negotiations. North Vietnam agreed to American withdrawal of troops in exchange for the release of American hostages. Many people thought the president might have lost his mind because he bombed them, the most intense bombing campaign, and did not warn them and did not say anything about it. He wanted to look as mean as he possibly could make it look. Truce objected to the fact that the North was not required to remove troops from the South. The peace pact was signed in Paris in January of '72. Then, Congress did something that has never been challenged in court yet, but I believe is unconstitutional, called the War Powers Act. This said that the president must inform Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops, withdraw troops in 60 days unless Congress authorizes an extension. This was vetoed by President Nixon, but overrode by Congress, and the courts have never tested the constitutionality of this because no president has ever been accused of violating it. The military procurement authorization prevented funding of any U.S. military action in Southeast Asia. Then the president changed his opinion or attention to the Middle East. This was the Yom Kippur War, which was on Yom Kippur night. the Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat attacked Israel on Yom Kippur Day, October 6, 1973. Golda Meir, the female prime minister of Israel, requested an American airlift and counterattacked on the promise of American support. Israel drove into Syria and encircled the Egyptian army and seized the Suez Canal. On October 17th, the Arab members of OPEC raised prices 400%. This is why there was gas shortages in the 70s. Because gas prices went up 4 times. You know, when you're used to paying a quarter for a gallon of gas, and then it's $1 overnight, that's a lot of increase. And I tell you that in the 70s, gas was 25 or less cents a gallon. Arab members suspended oil shipments to the West. They wouldn't sell oil to the United States and other Western countries that had supported Israel at any price. Saudi Arabia embargoed all oil exports to the U.S. and gas prices skyrocketed. In 1974, Israel reopened the Suez Canal and began to withdraw troops from occupied territory in exchange of OPEC ending its embargo. In addition to this, the presidency is beginning to unravel. Now, here is a picture of the 2 men, Woodward and Bernstein, who keep trying to recreate their place in history by bringing down President Bush during the war. But they were small-time reporters at the Washington Post. Now, Nixon did not have prior knowledge, we saw the break-in, but through the Plumbers and Houston planned that he did not authorize it, the Committee for Re-electing the President, led by R.H. Haldeman and John Mitchell, and authorized by the Plumbers, directed by G. Gordon Liddy and E. Edward Howard Hunt. Liddy gave $10,000 to Mitchell, Attorney General, to bug the Democratic National Committee. And Mitchell was the Attorney General of the United States. Then the Watergate break-in. And by the way, the reason why it's called the Watergate, it's a big apartment and business building, very ugly, by the way. If you ever go to Washington, D.C. and you see the Watergate building, it's an ugly building. But nonetheless, it's a big apartment complex right in downtown Washington. They were caught. Actually, what happened was this. They went in and bugged the building and got out successfully. But then they were arrested going back in the second time because the bugs didn't work. So if they would have just installed properly working bugs the first time, they never would have gotten caught. Nixon decided to cover up the problem with a full powers of the presidency. Nixon used the CIA to divert the FBI in its investigation, beginning the conspiracy to obstruct justice that ended his presidency. Now, the Watergate investigation began when North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin chaired a committee on Watergate that was broadcast on national TV, and it was huge business. John Dean, White House counsel, implicated Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And then a man by the name of Bloomfield, I love his name, Bloomfield, mentioned that there were recording devices in the White House and that Nixon had installed them. Now, he was not the first president to do so. But this was the first time that it was known. Then control of the tapes was key to the investigation. An independent counsel was appointed. Archibald Cox was appointed by Elliot Richardson, who was then the Attorney General, as a condition of receiving Senate confirmation. Cox refused to accept written summaries of the conversations on the text and tapes and wanted the actual tapes. Then on what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, although no one was actually killed, but several people were fired, Nixon ordered Elliot Richardson to fire Archibald Cox, and he refused. Richardson resigned, and William Ruckelshaus, isn't that a great name? Ruckelshaus, refused to comply with the order, and he was fired. After that, Solicitor General Robert Bork fired Archibald Cox. Then impeachment hearings were started. Nixon was investigated by the House in May of 1974. Nixon released 3,000 pages of edited transcripts. The new special counsel Leon Jaworski called for the tapes. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that he must surrender the tapes. The last week of July, the House Judiciary Committee recommended 3 articles of impeachment. Barry Goldwater was sent, who's the leader of the Republican senators, to Nixon, that he could count on between 15 and 18 votes in the Senate, but that conviction was almost certain. Nixon resigned before being tried by the Senate. Vice President Gerald Ford became president. Now, by the way, Gerald Ford became vice president after Spiro T. Agnew resigned because of bad things he had done when he was the governor of Maryland. So Gerald Ford was not elected vice president or president. He was appointed vice president and then became president when Richard Nixon resigned. He was the first vice president appointed by use of the 25th Amendment. This is a picture of Nixon giving the victory sign right before he gets on Air Force One to fly away after his resignation. Now, the presidency of Gerald Ford. Some people call this the interregnum. Congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, first elected in 1948. An Orthodox conservative who was an honest party man without a hint of scandal. 1 month into office, he pardoned Nixon. If he had not done that, he might have been elected president in 1976. And today, that is considered to be a smart thing on his part, but it really did hurt him politically. No deal was struck between him and Nixon that he would guarantee that he would pardon him. President presided over the fall of Saigon, and when you watch the video that you are required to watch for this section, which deals with the fall of Saigon, Ford is in Vail, Colorado, skiing while everything is falling apart in Vietnam. He negotiated the Helsinki Accords in 1975 with the Soviet Union, recognizing the boundary of European countries and that the USSR committed to human rights of freedom of migration, expression, and religion. Now, in 1967, the election, the Republicans had several issues. 1, 2 mentally unstable women tried to assassinate Ford, who were part of the Manson family. Ford signed the SALT II Accords and fired Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. Mrs. Ford celebrated Roe versus Wade. She was a liberal who was definitely pro-choice. he also agreed to give back to Panama the Panama Canal. Eventually, California Governor Ronald Reagan challenged Ford for the Republican nomination in '76 and actually did quite well. But by a narrow margin, Ford won the nomination at the convention. Democrats' issues, Watergate, and the sweeping victory in the midterm elections set them up very well for victory. Jimmy Carter, a former Georgia governor, was nominated with liberal Senator Walter Mondale as vice president, and he said he would never lie to them. And the American people wanted a Southern Baptist who was honest and grew peanuts to be president in '76. Carter started with a huge advantage, and then he gave an interview to Playboy magazine that impressed no one. Conservatives didn't like it because it was in Playboy magazine. Democrats didn't like it because he said things like, "I have committed adultery in my mind many times." Now, what he meant by that, a lot, as you might be aware, there might be someone within religious circles that might suggest that he may have seen something and had a thought and didn't act upon it, but he wanted to sound virtuous. But he's writing, this is published in Playboy magazine, where there's adultery in the mind going on. Anyone who's reading this article has issues. That really hurt his campaign, especially among evangelicals. Then, he promised not to lie to the American people. And then Ford stated in a debate that Poland was not under Soviet domination, which people said, "You're crazy, it's part of the Soviet bloc." Jimmy Carter won, but not by the expected landslide. Also, Jimmy Carter was also threatened by a violent rabbit while canoeing near his home. A rabbit that had swam out into the river and jumped into his boat, and he had to beat it back with an oar. Beware of those wild rabbits in Georgia. To this day, no one is quite sure what happened with the wild rabbit story. Putting that with the Playboy story, you can see that he had some issues during the campaign. Jimmy Carter won, but not by the expected landslide. He took 50.1% to Ford 48, with the electoral vote margin of 296 to 241. And if you notice, Carter won the Solid South and Texas, plus these liberal states. You would think Minnesota and Wisconsin are not liberal states, but up here, they're practically communist in Minnesota. And Wisconsin, they're out there on their dairy farms, but they are liberal. And then, of course, this is a Democratic area. If he had not pardoned Nixon, he might have gotten some more support up here in the Northeast. Almost any change would have put Ford over the top. Jimmy Carter, he smiled a lot. Now, who is Jimmy Carter? He's the son of a peanut broker from Plains, Georgia. He's still living. If he's not 100 years old, he's very close to it. I think he was 99 on his last birthday. He and his wife were married like 75 or 76 years. They are the longest married couple in any political couple. Graduated from the Naval Academy and served as an atomic sub-program. So he was a nuclear engineer within the Navy. Carter ran for governor and lost, but in 1971 shifting to appeal to white super races. A progressive in style and a liberal in substance, saw himself as a trustee of the public welfare and a man above politics, attributed sordid motives to his opponents, committed to equity for all, and wanted to balance the budget. You would think that today, or when Jimmy Carter was still active in politics, that he was out to spend money everywhere. When he was president, he was fiscally conservative and refused to spend money at times that might have helped him get reelected. Saw himself as a Washington outsider, alienated himself from Congress, gave the image of an out-of-control administration. He fired every one of his cabinet members during a meeting. He wanted to get a fresh start, I think, of his administration, but it just looked like he was out of control. Pardoned the Vietnam draft dodgers and canceled 19 water projects for economic grounds in the West and South that were very popular in their local areas. Then, the economic crisis, liberals on some things, conservative on others. Welfare reform was to provide decent wage through workers for all able-bodied and a decent income for those that could not. Social Security reform raised payroll taxes, but did not tackle other issues. Poll numbers began to slide. Promoted himself as a citizen president. Carried his own suitcase when traveling on Air Force One, which no president had ever done before. Enrolled his daughter in the failing public schools in Washington, D.C. instead of sending her to private school. If he wanted to, he could have sent her to Mount Carmel. Dispensed with playing Hail to the Chief when entering a building. After 3 months, they brought it back because people said they never noticed when he arrived. Now, President Trump did not play Hail to the Chief either. He had Lee Greenwood's God Bless America, or whatever the song is. Not God Bless America, but that song that he sings about America. In fact, when I was at the Trump rally in Lexington, Lee Greenwood was there to sing that song himself. So he kind of changed the tradition too. Losing the battle for energy independence. Proposed an energy policy penalizing waste and established tax credits and other incentives for conservation. Foreign policy. Human rights began to dominate foreign policy for the Carter administration. Open diplomacy and containment of international communism, whose goals would often conflict with the other. A freeze on détente. Arms negotiations were conducted by the Carter public denuclearization of the USSR for human rights violations. SALT II treaty was opposed by the Senate. In the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to prop up the pro-communist government there, shocked President Carter. And he supported covert CIA aid to the Afghan rebels, which helped create Al-Qaeda, which we are still dealing with today. So we helped form Al-Qaeda. 2, supported the embargo of all grain sales to the Soviet Union, even if it meant that the Russians starved. And boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980. The Carter Doctrine, an outside force that tries to control the Persian Gulf region, would be attacked and vital interests of the United States. He supported the establishment of black majority governments in Africa, even if this was not good for the fight against international communism. He used economic pressure in Latin America to get military governments to improve human rights. He made Pinochet regime in China was planned by the United States. Negotiated a new Panama Canal Treaty that passed the Senate by 1 vote. Supported the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, who turned out to be communists. And embraced a reform-minded and anti-communist but weak government in El Salvador. Then the Camp David Accords. These are the Camp David Accords. Seen as an honest broker who would not always side with Israel, proposed the establishment of fair boundaries with a homeland for the Palestinians. The Likud party was in power in Israel in 1977, and this was their leader, Menachem Begin, who was one of the most virulent anti-Arab radicals. And it's amazing that he's the man who first makes peace with the Arabs. Interesting. Carter invited Begin and Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat to Camp David to do peace deals. Carter had to be a go-between because these two men hated each other so much, Sadat and Begin, that they would not sit in the same room together. In fact, Carter had to personally go and get Anwar Sadat to unpack his suitcase and stay. They only got together on the very end when they signed the agreement. If you notice, they're not actually shaking each other's hands. They're each shaking a hand of Carter's. Because they did not like each other at all. Begin and Sadat signed 2 vague pacts. They also won Nobel Peace Prize in 1978. And Begin and Sadat came to Washington to sign a deal in 1979. Anwar Sadat will be assassinated by the military in 1980 during a parade in which he was reviewing the troops because they felt that he had embarrassed the Arab cause by siding with Israel during this treaty. And then this here, we'll talk about when we come back, is the Iran hostage crisis. This is a picture of the Iran radicals climbing over the fence into... This helped get Reagan elected. Okay, so next time we'll get together, and first thing we'll have is our report on Reagan, and then we'll catch up right here where we left off.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
When is the last field ministry summit?
Oh, okay. I need to send out a notice for that. I thought you were going to ask what was the last day you could sign up for classes in the fall.
I do need to talk to you about that sometime. I don't know if I'm coming back, but I was wondering if I could talk to you sometime about getting a plan if I do decide to come back.
Well, Dr. Long is coming for commencement. You could talk to her about the elementary ed program.
I don't know.
But, I mean, you can, first of all, you'd have to know what BA you want. And then we can talk about a plan. And you can do it, you can do it here, or you can do it in Kansas.
Yes.
Or you could get a job working for us and do it part-time.
Well, if I'm offered a job, that's an idea, but
if I tell certain people that you might be interested in one, you'll have a job offer, I can assure you.
If I take classes, I would come back.
Yeah,
But
well, anyway, do you have an idea of what you want to do?
I don't. I
Okay,
don't yet, and so
it's not exactly important, but at this point, the classes you take would definitely need to build towards the completion of your professional thing. And So that's a piece of information I would need to know.
Yes, I don't know what degree.
And you can have more than one option, and we can deal with more than one scenario.
Yeah, it's really confusing, but if you have time to talk about it with me sometime.
Yeah, I am free normally in the morning on Wednesday and Friday, or in the afternoons on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Well, I have classes until 3:10.
Now, what I'm saying is, now, so on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, like today, I am free, clear free, every afternoon. Afternoons on Tuesday and Thursday.
Okay.
And mornings, Wednesday and Friday.
Okay, so maybe a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon?
Sure, yeah. If you make an appointment, great, or if not, if I'm
Yeah.
in there and I'm by myself and I'm not really
Yeah.
committed to anything, I mean, if perchance I can't deal with it at that moment, that's fine, but normally, just open the door and say, could you talk to me about this, and I'll ask you, what program do you want us to talk about, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. Do you have any time tomorrow then?
Tomorrow would be, okay, January is coming tomorrow.
Okay.
And I know he wants to have
Okay.
lunch with Dr. Pokai, so, and me. So I can do tomorrow, but it would probably want to schedule that later in the afternoon.
Which would be fine, and if Thursday's better for you, that would also be fine.
I can do anything on Thursday, I believe. I have no idea what my afternoon will look like as it relates to him coming.
It's okay, I can just look at your office.
Yeah, and if I'm there, stop by.
Okay.
And anytime Thursday afternoon, I'm gonna be available to talk to you. Yeah, and I wanna do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
And then the date for the field initiative.
okay, yes, let me, the last, okay, yeah, I need to get this. This week coming up, the 5th should be the last one.
Thank you, Dr.
Mhm.